Well, thank you for inviting me here to kick off your distinguished speaker series. I'm flattered to be the first one this year, and you asked me to speak about two topics which are very dear to me, communications and competition. I spent many years working in both of them, and it's now practically 2 years to the day since I retired. And it's amazing how when one retires and is out of action, one has time to reflect and actually look at things quite differently than you did when you were in the pool. I would want to speak. This topic is very heavy. Unfortunately very full of jargon and it's complex. And so I'm going to try to speak plain and slowly. But I warn you beforehand, it's not an easy walk we're going to take. What I'm going to do is going to speak to you first of all what we have by way of communications, then the traditional concepts, acts, and institutions that we use to run communications and also competition. What do we lack? Then I'm going to say a few words about the digital revolution, the industry responses that we have seen, the government response, and then finally, what would be an ideal way to reform it, to deal with this phenomena, which we all are very well aware of. And lastly, if there is no ideal reform, what could one do by incremental reform, faut-il, so to speak. So first of all, what do we have in Basica? We are in Canada actually very blessed. We have a very fine wireline network. It connects everybody anywhere except the far north. It is inexpensive. The costs are uniform, and we charge connection on the basis of how many people get connected, not on time used, which lots of other countries do. The big cities subsidize the rural areas through some intricate regulation, which I won't explain. We have fiber cables all across the country, and over 90% of our system has been deregulated, forborne from competition, as a technical phrase is. And so we are really very blessed that way. When you look at television side, we're also very blessed. We have an OTA system that covers the whole country, covers it digitally. Over 90%, actually it's about 96% of people are connected by cable, which is one of the highest cable penetration in the world. We have 2 satellite providers which cover every corner of Canada. We have 5 networks, 3 English, 2 French. We have a national broadcaster in both languages, and we actually have one of the most varied TV offerings, and we compare it to other nations in terms of content, in terms of language, in terms of specialties. It's phenomenal. And we have a very thriving production industry. Thriving point is we actually created on the back of the broadcasters and which we subsidize that way. We also, what do we have on the wireless side? We have 3 national wireless providers. And we have a 4th local provider in every province, in most of them at least. We have better, by the way, very few other countries have more than 2 providers, let alone 3 and local ones on top. We have better coverage than the US, notwithstanding our larger mass and technology. And we have the most up-to-date technology. We have wonderful device offering, and nobody in Canada is deprived of anything in the wireless area that's available somewhere else. We don't have to wait, or it's because our network doesn't support it or whatever. And on top of it, we have the competition. The twin part of it is to regulation, to deal with that part of the world which is not regulated. We have a relatively modern act that has been updated several times, has quite tough criminal provisions. We put people in jail and fine them. We have a civil regime that provides injunctive relief. We have provisions there regarding international cooperation, so we can work with anybody who has a competition regime. We have very advanced provisions regarding electronic evidence obtaining, etc. We have an independent agency devoted to that. We have a special court, the competition tribunal. And Canada is seen as a bit of a leader in this field. We were instrumental in creating the ICN, the International Competition Network, which is the umbrella group for all competition agencies around the world. And you noticed, what did I speak about? Telecommunication, broadcasting, wireless, competition. Those are the traditional concepts. That's how we have looked at the world in these silos. This is telecom, this is broadcasting, this is wireless, and here sort of competition for anything that's not regulated. And these concepts are based on specific acts. We have a Telecom Act, which really, the way I look at it, if you look at it from 10,000 feet, a main goal is to provide equal and affordable communication to consumers, to ensure that anybody who provides service is facility-based, to make sure that there is comparative service, rural and urban, there's not too much of a disconnect, that the providers are facility-based, and also we have very large and intricate regulation about the connection between carriers, the pricing between carriers, and for protection of consumers, so they don't just find themselves without telephone line and freeze to death, etc. But that's sort of the key of it. And it was made in '93 at a time when voice was really the main use for telecom, and it was at a time when the industry was still dominated by monopolies, and the idea was to restrain the monopolies as much as possible. Then in broadcasting, we have an act that really provides access to all Canadians, both as users and providers. That's what the key it is. If you read through the act, it's 2 pages of objectives, but I always boiled it down to exactly that. It makes sure that if you want to watch TV, you can. If you want to provide something for TV, there are avenues for you. We have provisions for ownership of broadcast undertakings, making sure that they're Canadian. We want to the other part is we want to make sure that the content is overall Canadian and reflects Canada. You say, notice I say we, I automatically fall into my CRTC pattern. I apologize, that's the act, does that, not me. And so those are 2 overwhelming themes, access and content. And we are quite the leader in regulatory devices in order to subsidize content. I remember I met my Austrian counterpart, and the Austrians, of course, live in the shadow of the Germans, and I always worried about having German content, not Austrian. I said, what do you do to foment Austrian content? He said, very simple. We watch what you're doing, and we'll copy everything. You are our leader when it comes to content protection. And we, as I say, we're quite inventive. We also have a national broadcast. I'm not going to speak to it. As you all know, its aim is to provide broadcasting in both language to reflect Canada to Canadian. It's a huge subject, just suffice it to say, it is part of the Broadcasting Act. And then all our wireless is provided for in the Radio Communication Act. It is last amended in '87. It basically sets out that the frequencies allows the minister to set out the frequencies. There's a broad determination by the ITU, and then we do specific ones. Most of the spectrum is for public purposes. Then some are private public, such radio and TV. And then there are certain totally private, which is actually a small part of the whole spectrum, which is the broadband and telephone, and so that you can feed your mobile devices, telephones, etc. Industry determines what frequency can be used for what purposes. It grants licenses. Once you get the license, you have it until you give it up, but you cannot sell it without ministerial consent. And also the licenses are depending what purposes, either for beauty contests, as they call it, i.e. who's best suited, who will use it to best purpose, or by auction, i.e. who pays the most. And we have a Competition Act, which, as I said, is very generally the Generic Act has been amended several times, but was only small. The last principal one was in '86. Criminally, we are quite, it's the way as Americans in antitrust. We go after people who price fix, who market or collude. We throw them in jail. We find them and try to prevent the contract. On the civil side, the 2 areas are merger review, trying to make sure that people don't buy their competitors and create a monopoly, and also that they don't engage in anti-competitive practices. That's a tough one to define, because where does the vigorous Competition Act and where does anti-competitive act start? It's not a very clean line, and we do have the other limitation is when you win, you only get a prohibition from the court, says you may not do that. In some instances, the commissioner can fine, but there are no damage. It's not like the US where you sue your competitor and you get damages, triple damages. Now the institutions on top of for this are very interesting. They're divided in an odd way. Industry Canada makes wireless telecom policy, spectrum policy, manages the whole spectrum and licenses. It has, but in terms of telecom, essentially, it has, everything has gone to the Act is under the supervision of the Minister of Industry, but it's really administered by the CRTC. In Heritage, the Canadian Heritage is responsible for broadcast policy. It's responsible for seeing that the broadcast industry has the support it needs to provide it. It administers something called the CMF, the Canadian Media Fund, which is this big sort of support for the industry, but it again has very no operational responsibility. The CRTC regulates both wireline, the telecom, and broadcasting. It does not regulate wireless. We have forborne from wireless from beginning of time when it first came on the scene. There was a feeling it does not need regulation. The competition will between wireless carriers will serve as a necessary regulator. And then we have the CRTC, the Competition Bureau, who's generally responsible for all anti-competitive conduct in non-regulated commercial areas. And essentially some areas are forborne, such as wireless. It also looks at mergers from a competition point of view. CRTC looks at it from a policy point of view. And in effect, if you have a big merger, you need approval by both. Then in order to keep these things apart, the courts have invented something called the regulated conduct defense, which basically means if you're regulated, you're not subject to the Competition Act. Don't worry, you do what the regulator says, and he takes the responsibility for your activities. Sounds wonderful, logical in practice. After all, if you're regulated, you don't need. Problem is, where's the boundary? Where does regulation stops? What does it mean you are subject to regulation? To what extent? And what if the regulator has a capacity, but he hasn't used it, he hasn't exercised? He may, but he doesn't exercise, etc. And how far does the regulation? It's actually a messy field, and there are a huge number of cases on this, and it's every time in industry, regulated industry has an encounter with the Competition Bureau, it raises this, and it's a source for great source for litigation for lawyers, but also a source for great confusion and inhibits both agencies. Now, what are our key control levers that we have? We actually have two. Number one is Canadian ownership. We insist that every player in the communications field is Canadian owned and controlled. Recently, we have made a small amendment saying that wireless carriers who have less than 10% of the market do not have to be Canadian. Nobody's asked the question what happens when they grow beyond 10%, but there's no danger at the present time. And the other one is access. We actually say if you want to play in this field, if you want to have spectrum, if you want to transmit something by wire, by cable, by satellite or something, you need a license from us. That's our main control. And the license, of course, you can have with conditions. And this is, the whole system was built on these two principles. A, make sure it's Canadian own it, and B, access control. And with that, for instance, we enforce access, we make sure that people don't have too much influence, we deal with prices, or we put limits or ceilings on prices. We make sure there's too much corporate control, or we mandate corporate behavior, etc. And we also force subsidies to fund Canadian content. So it's a very fast overview, a sort of bird's eye view, but you got to set the scene. Otherwise, the rest of I'm saying it makes no sense. Well, what do we lack? We have absolutely no national strategy. I haven't heard anybody speak about one and put one forward. We don't have one. We've had rounds of consultations, several depending how you count, but we have not been able to come up with something. And we are now in 2014, and the EU has had one, an elaborate one, which announced in 2010, so you can imagine when they started working on it. Same as the US, UK, or Germany. They're well thought out strategies. They explain the aim, they explain what can be economically, what can be done technologically, what should be done in terms of education, what should be turned to mentor, training, etc. We don't have that. What we really don't even have is a holistic concept based on the present reality rather than old paradigms. We still talk about telecom and wireless, etc., as if they're two separate things. We really need new legislation. We need a new institutional framework. We need better coordination and complementarity between agencies. And, you know, we may also have to clarify ownership. And if we don't do that, there are dangers ahead. There are costs involved in this. Our lack of policy, our drifting, causes disinvestment. You've seen the recent example of Verizon. I mean, here we say, please come and open the wireless. You know, we'll give you something that no Canadian has. You may own 2 blocks. The big boys with whom you're competing may only own 1 block. You know, a special invitation, gold-plated, and still, no, they're not interested. We're drifting back slowly to regulation. I mean, in wireless, which started off being totally unregulated, we now have a code of conduct for the wireless provider. We're talking about regulating, what do they call it, roaming charges. Now, once you start mixing with charges and with prices, etc., that's a slippery slope. You know, you can't do one part not affect the rest. The regulated broadcasting, you know, the sort of scheduled broadcasting is already in danger. People don't like it anymore. People want to have access when they want it. They don't want to watch things what they want. And we have not only what that you have to watch it to schedule. If you're a cable subscriber, you actually have to subscribe to the basic package, which means you have something like 30 channels that you pay for, even if you never watch them. You've got to pay for them and say so. You know. We have a production industry which is basically based on obviously selling their product, but because the market is so small and it's very difficult to sell broadcasting products outside your own country, but they require a subsidy. But the subsidy comes from the television industry. As the television industry suffers, and so will the production drop off because there will be less subsidy. And of course, you know, this is an industry, this is known for its innovation, growth, and productivity. It affects the whole economy. If we don't do anything about it, we will see the effect very quickly. And of course, we have a national broadcaster whom I'm not going to talk about, but it's on decline, as we all know, and God knows what can be done and should be done. And the world in telecom really has changed. If you look, I take a short break. It started with telecom regulation, which was done in the US under the antitrust, because if AT&T was too big, too powerful. And it was a movement that started very gently with separation of local, long distance and local service. And people realized how much more effective telecom systems can be if you break them up, and it became literally a revolution around the world. It took off very quickly. It resulted in the WTO actually making a basic telecom agreement for worldwide, which everybody adheres to. And essentially what everybody tries to do is bring forbearance as much as possible as circumstances allow, and let competition rule, and so that communication, which was thought of as a natural monopoly, you have to regulate it, etc., actually isn't a natural monopoly. As long as you ensure interconnection, it thrives and flourishes in a way nobody has had foreseen when you deregulate it. And and that's what we know. And we've also seen the digital revolution. I don't have to talk to you about how our world has changed, you know, in terms of computerization and the emergence of the internet. That any communication now in any form, voice, data, images, film, or whatever, can travel anywhere and can be accessed anywhere by anybody, anytime, etc. And we now see the portable device or explosion which do absolutely anything people want to do, wherever they want to do it. And we see consumer expectation growing with this, and in demanding both on side access to the system anywhere, anytime, and input anywhere, anytime. And the effect of this digital revolution, we've seen on the industry, it actually had another effect. Technologically, everything is the same. It's the same technology that's being used, so the distinction in technological terms between telecommunication, telephone, broadcasting, and so have disappeared. But the industry itself has actually reacted. We see an incredibly massive concentration, both horizontally and vertically. Take a company like Bell. They're into telecoms, they're into broadcasting, they're into satellite, they're into cable, they're into internet, they're into wireless, they're into their own broadcast companies. They're basically content and carriage. They own it all. And it's not only them. Look at Quebec here, of course, absolutely the same thing. Rogers, so TEL is not quite there yet, but it's there. This absolutely massive concentration of the industry because they realized thinking in silos and looking at these different, that makes no sense. We as regulators, sorry, that's telecom, that's broadcast, that's a different thing. Different guy is responsible, different matter, different act, different remedies. This ICT sector, as it's called, is a tremendous driver. As you can see the figures there, accounting for 75% of Canadian GDP since 2007. So it is something we should not ignore. And if we do so, we do at our peril. And also, it has really shifted consumer behavior, and we're seeing all sorts of phenomena that we still don't know how to, what they mean, where they go, the social media, the texting, the gaming, the interacting, and how they can be translated and will be sooner or later in our form of governance, for instance, and so on. Now, what has been the Canadian government response? Next to none. We have some very minimal legislative change. We have a provisions for do not call list, or the anti-spam legislation that just will enter into force. But those are really the only legislative changes we've seen in the last 20 years since when we enacted the Broadcasting Act and the Telecom Act and revised the Radio Communication Act. Those were modern, up-to-date statutes at the edge. They're no longer there at all, and as I say, we're now fiddling with such things as do not call lists. We have seen no institutional change. We have the same institution in charge of everything. And we have seen limited government decisions. There was, what was like, 7 years ago, a direction to CRTC on forbearance saying, deregulate telecom, let it subject to competition. We have enough competition now. We have the telephone carriers, we have the cable companies in there, we have the wireless companies. You do no longer have to have the heavy end of regulation. And that was a very useful direction. We've also basically gone selling spectrum auction spectrum by auction rather than by beauty concepts. And the last two auctions, we have done a little bit of industrial engineering, providing for set-asides. There's some spectrum that can be bought by newcomers, but not by incumbents, hopefully creating competition. There's been a marked focus on consumers and trying to do something for consumers. And there's small things like, say, an office of the competition or consumer telephone complaints, etc. And there have been national strategy consultations with great fanfare, but with absolutely no result. Now, what we need, seems to me it's clear, we need a holistic approach. We have to think of this as one, not one. We need a strategy, we need new legislation, we need some institutional reform, and we need better interaction between complementary agencies. Excuse me. Now, an ideal route to reform, the one we've traditionally used in this country, is appoint a national commission to formulate the strategy, appoint some wise people, have them give them time to study, see submissions, and do it. The result would undoubtedly be a consolidation of the acts, the telephone act, the broadcasting, radio communication in one act, in effect, an act for transmission. We'd also have to have some provision, some really sensible provision to finance Canadian content. Probably would address the role of the national broadcaster. We would restructure the regulator, make sure he has the proper tools. We would deal with such things as Canadian ownerships, etc. But the key one would be looking forward, looking at it from one strategy, one aim, and having some concept of where to be going. Presumably, we would also make sure we have one minister in charge of communications. We would have one regulator with better tools. With better tools, I mean such things, for instance, as fining. The CRTC can't fine you. They can take your license away and put you out of business, or they can wag their finger at you, but there's no fining ability in between. You know, there's where the production subsidy for Canadian media, anybody who's in the film industry or in the media industry will tell you, it's a myriad of sources that you have to access. They all have different terms, different conditions, and you spend half of the time on getting the funds together rather than being productive. And if you ever see a Canadian movie and see the credits and see of all the people who have seen, at least 2 pages of credits of various agencies have put $1 into this. And our regulators have to be able to cooperate, which you can't do right now. They're actually prohibited by legislation from interchanging information when they have a merger. You have 2 agencies looking at it, and they cannot say, I talk to each other referring to the information they have received. On the competition side, and we're clearly moving into an area where we're going to hopefully have less regulation, we've got to bring in some sort of civil right of action for anti-competitive practice. What that I mean is that you can sue your competitor and get damages rather than trying to convince the commissioner to take your case or taking it yourself, and at the end of the day, all you get is a prohibition. The commissioner himself needs fining power. He has very limited fining power. When we have reviews of mergers, it should be done the same way we do it in banks, etc. In banks and airlines, basically Competition Bureau goes first, makes an assessment, says yes or no on these conditions. It then goes to the minister, and the minister can say yes or no. If he disagrees with them, and he has to publicly explain why, in the interest of national policy, you overrule the specialty guy who thinks from competition reasons something is difficult or should be let go and you don't. And we should spell out by regulation what this regulated conduct defense means rather than having every court interpreted and reinterpreted over and over. What's the likelihood of this? I'm a realist, pretty dim. I spent 5 years as chair of the CRTC asking for this. My uptake was absolutely zilch from anybody, from the politicians, from the industry, from anything. Why? It's really broadcasting is a problem. It's the elephant in the room, if you want. It makes it so difficult because, as Simon Riesman once told me, he said, never touch anything with broadcasting. They own all the mics. And he's absolutely right. So you cannot have a good debate because it will be taken over, it will be steered. It is very difficult to direct it. And the stakeholders are well entrenched, well connected, and makes their views known. And also, strangely enough, we don't have a public outcry for reform. Canadians, by and large, are quite happy because, as I started out, our system works very well today. People bitch about a few things here and there, like about roaming rates or high, but by and large, no. And I think they are also partially dim because royal commissions are considered yesterday's approach. People nowadays expect to do things online. They want to do directly. They don't want to do quickly. They want to interact, etc. That's really not the way you do, and it's hard to do that in a royal commission approach. There's also the fear, and I think probably not unjustified, the regulation. If you have a royal commission, you always wind up with more regulation, more things. There is this sort of pro-regulatory bend usually in the outcome of this. And it's a very dynamic field, and we've had some big failures, and governments don't forget those. I mean, we tried to, at one point in time, to put out a standard for cell phones, flopped totally. Digital radio, same thing, LMCS, etc. So this field is not that easy to get it right, and government has no record at all to it. So That being the thing, is it possible to have some incremental reform, faut-il, so to speak, so at least we're better prepared and we can compete? If we assume no Royal Commission, no digital strategy, no major legislation, or at best legislation at the periphery, if that's a given, and I think most observers would think that probably is a given today, what can we do? Well, the government could announce a coherent policy. Minister Moore, then Minister of Heritage, wrote a letter in June 2012 to my successor at the CRTC, outlining the closest thing I've seen to the government's statement on strategy. It actually was not made public. Why? I don't know. It came out through an access to information piece. Well, he notwithstanding he's Minister of Heritage, he addressed both broadcasting and telecom, and he says, I want to see better consumer affordability. Consumer service complaints should be well addressed. Broadcast distribution undertaking, i.e. cable companies, should be regulated only as much as possible. There should be multiple choice for consumers, and we consider alternatives regulation. In telecom, the emphasis should be on competition, on investment, innovation, consumer choice, and the Commissioner for Consumer Telephone Complaints' role should be enhanced. Now, he again falls back into the silos of telecom and broadcasting. But at least this is something of a strategy, something of a vision. Why on earth did we not make this public? Why not put it in a somewhat more coherent form and tell the industry and the world, basically, this is where we're going? I don't know. I think it can be done. The other thing that can be done, non-legislatively, use the Public Service Rearrangement and Transfer of Duties Act. Other than a few lawyers, nobody has ever heard of it. But it's actually quite a potent statute act which allows the government to mix the public service and shape it in any which way it wants. You can any function from one minister and give it to another. You can take a portion of a public service and put it to another. You can change the ministries, etc. We used to have a Department of Communication. It disappeared into industry there. How? By use of this act. Then 6 years later or so it was legislated, etc. I personally, as legal advisor to the government, used that act at least 4 times, I think, etc., to do major changes and change responsibility. So you'd use that in order to recreate the Department of Communications, for instance, if you wanted, put it all under one minister. You could take the wireless portion, whatever portion you want, whether it's a pure administration, whether it's the whole part dealing with the licensing of cell phones, or whether you wanted to go even the policy, the auctioning, etc., and pass it over to the CRTC. That's certainly one thing that's open to the government, and I think since there seems to be a reluctance to address things wholesale, it certainly could be done non-legislative this way. You can also, the power of direction, which exists under both the Broadcasting Act and the Telecom Act, you can use it to give direction to CRTC, so that whatever part of the spectrum you give to them, because the division between wireless and wireline is so artificial, you could specify how you want them to blend it and hold them together, and administer it together. I'm sorry. You could also you should focus on wireless. Wireless is absolutely the key to the future. This is where the whole trend is moving because of the portability, because of the freedom that it allows. We have not declared wireless to be the focus of our communication policy at all, but we could. We could also, for instance, allow a secondary market in spectrum. Why is the spectrum can only be sold with the consent of the minister? In other nations, it's not. Go just south of the border. They have a vibrant market. It was originally done in order to prevent people from speculating in it and doing quick flips, also to avoid somebody picking up all of the spectrum and excluding others. But both, certainly the exclusion issue could address through competition policies, and the quick flips. First of all, I doubt that you would see something, but other countries don't seem to have a major problem. I think it's more a mirage than reality. It would also allow a lot of people access to spectrum right now who don't have it. We have also never thought of establishing a regime for third-party access to wireless. Third-party means that you can buy from somebody at cost plus a given percent. So if you're not a wireless booth yourself, but you can buy spectrum, say, Rogers, please sell it to me. And you Rogers set a policy of which we have in telecom on the wireline, but not in wireless, that it costs this much to produce, so you have to pay him so much plus X%. So he is being kept whole, but you allow a sharing of wireless and allow a lot of people to operate wireless devices or systems who do not own the underlying structure. And we could make more frequency available for unlicensed use. We always say, this is the use, and you may use it for that. Problem is, there are all sorts of uses that people come up that nobody ever dreamt of, nobody ever heard of, but you have to give them a chance to do it. And the experience that we've had in other nations, when we have made frequency available for unlicensed use, it leads to a tremendous productivity and use that nobody ever imagined beforehand. And by the way, if you think my whole idea of focus on wireless is only my idea, our neighbor to the south, what did he say just a couple of months ago? The world is going wireless and we must not fall behind. Expanded wireless broadband will trigger the creation of innovative and new businesses, provide cost-effective connection in rural areas, increase productivity, blah, blah, blah. Clearly the Americans got it. They see it, and I think we should be blind if we wouldn't do it. And by the way, you don't have to quote Americans. Our own Ottawa-based Information Communications and Technology Council, what do they say here? On a worldwide state, mobile subscription rose from 5.5 to 6 billion, equivalent to 96% of the world population. So this is exploding, and this is only what we know today. God knows where it's going to go tomorrow. Now, there are other things. We have this whole idea of everybody in telecom has to be facility-based. You have to own the facility before you operate it. It's a question whether that's really necessary. First of all, we have built tremendous facilities. If somebody can make a business not owning facility, why not? If I don't want to be unkind, you can call them resellers or whatever, or they're partially owned facility, etc. But why we insisted on this, on the idea that only if people will build facility if that's a condition on getting the license. We are past that point. We have the infrastructure. We don't need this link anymore, and we think we should revisit it. As I mentioned before, the funding for Canadian content is absolutely horrendous. All of this is non-statutory and could easily be done, consolidated and simplified. And again, as I say, the national broadcaster could flourish, certainly, if it had stable funding. Now, this government is apt to do a little bit of legislation on the margin in the budget acts. And I would say, there is an opportunity. If you want to make peripheral legislation, there's some things that can be done. For instance, very simple amendment would be to provide, if we're going to maintain foreign ownership, have one body to determine it. Whether it's a CRTC or Industry Canada, I don't care. It's just one, so you can't have problems of different decisions by different bodies. Tower sharing, it's not a very difficult concept intellectually. It just doesn't happen because they don't have to. You can legislate, you can make something happen, and then everybody can get on the tower, and then let's decide whether the consumer wants it, not whether because a poor guy can't get on the tower and therefore he can't get his signal out. This is something that could be very simply fixed. You can give the authority to CRTC or do a separate regime. I don't care, but it's not a world-shaking problem, but it's actually a very serious break to development of the whole wireless area. Under the Radio Communications Act, there's actually a provision for civil rights. You can sue somebody and get damages if he interferes with your signal. That's what it provides for right now. Well, all you have to do is a two-line change and make it across the board. It doesn't have to be only for interfering with the signal. Engaging in anti-competitive activities would do the trick. So these amendments could be done. We could also provide, and should provide, that CRTC and CBC, when the CRB, Competition Bureau, and the CRTC, when they deal with mergers, they can share the information, they can jointly look at it and exchange ideas and views so that there's a common approach. And as I said before, I would adopt the bank model and for here, say, let's have the issue looked at by this, on the basis of good, same information. First of all, here CBC, keep saying CBC, sorry, Competition Bureau says, there's a problem here, this has to be addressed, whatever it is. And then the CRTC can say, oh, yes, we agree with you, and do that and something else. Or no, we actually think in terms of better communications or better broadcasting or whatever it is, we overrule you for these and these purposes. You don't have to comply. We have done it and it works well. As I mentioned, fining powers could be established for breaches of both for the CRTC and the Competition Bureau, and the regulated conduct defense could be spelled out. And lastly, we should all do all of this sooner or later. If we're not going to have an overall approach, let's at least have this piecemeal approach, because we all know communication is essential to the world. We live in a digital economy. Wireless is becoming more and more important, and if we fail to address it, we will see it in terms of disinvestment incentives. We've already seen them. I gave you some examples. Our industry, which is already oligarchic, will become more concentrated. And really, what I'm worried about, you will have lack of innovation and a lack of economic growth, which of course means we will all suffer. So in summary, I think a wholesale regime, a wholesale reform should be there, a digital revolution cries for it. Other nations have done it. I don't think we will be doing it. But let's aim at least for incremental reform. Let's implement non-slavery, what can be done, and do incremental reforms through budget bills if necessary. Make wireless a focus. If we do all of this, we won't become leaders, but at least we can be nimble followers. Thank you.